Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the NASA Alumni League First Thursday virtual program. It's February the 4th, 2021. I'm Stokes McMillan. And today we have a very entertaining presentation by Alumni League member Jim Oberg. So Jim was loaned to NASA JSC by the United States Air Force in 1975, and then he homesteaded at JSC. He was on console for the first shuttle liftoff 40 years ago, and later worked proximity ops and rendezvous missions. Then he finished his NASA work in the mid-1990s, designing the ISS orbit and the first shuttle link up to the first Russian module. He made a special study of the secrets of the Soviet space program, wrote books, and consulted with major news media teams. He's always been fascinated by the widespread public misunderstandings of spaceflight, and that will be the subject of today's talk. And so now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Jim Oberg.
Thank you, Stokes, and hi, everybody. And we've been together in the rooms before. We will be again. Right now, though, we're being safe. Cookie and I got our COVID shots a couple of days ago, first ones. So we're on our way to, we hope, immunity. What people are not immune to, it seems, is misunderstanding spaceflight. And we've all run into people, relatives, friends, family, who've asked us questions that sound bizarre to us. One of the most bizarre is, how do people see things on space flights or see space flights and not recognize them and misinterpret them very, very badly? This is one particular study that I've made, and I can give all sorts of justifications and rationalizations for it, but the main thing is it's been fun, because looking at these reports and combining them, talking to people and actually convincing a few of them what they really saw has been very productive and very enjoyable activity. We know from our own professional.
Jimmy, remember, go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Sorry?
Share your screen now.
I gotta move it up here. Hold on.
And everyone else, please mute your mics.
I see that in the meeting. I'm back to my meeting contacts. I don't see this the share control page.
Oh, you might need to minimize the Zoom, or halfway to Zoom.
Show, okay, copy invitation, edit, start. No, I'm back to the. Okay, no, I don't have the bottom icons for that. Do you want to start? Here's the Zoom meeting. No, I got, but my chart here simply says my personal meeting ID.
Well, where was it? You had it a while ago when you shared it.
Well, I had the, hold on, I had that up here.
You might minimize your charts for now and go to the Zoom screen.
Okay, minimize the charts. I'm on the Zoom screen here.
It should be at the bottom. You found it a while ago.
Yeah, well, until. Okay, no, we have. Wait a sec here. There we go. All right. Here's the share screen.
It's super easy to skip and schedule deliveries. Take a short.
I just hit share screen.
Someone's talking. Could you mute your mic, please?
Okay, I've got my presentation up. You see that? It says I am screen sharing.
Yeah, I can see it.
We got it now.
Okay. All right. My favorite cartoon about this kind of event is the one of the 3-year-old kid holding the phone and saying, "No, Gamma, pull down the icon, pull down the talk icon, use your finger, no, any finger." And the kid is 3-year-old, and of course it's a made-up caption, but he's telling his grandmother how to get back on, like we did here. All right, we all see the first page then. Is that it?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Do you see the whole? Because I have some of the faces up here. I'm gonna drop that. And there's the chart. And I can run it. All right. There's a lot of stuff on these charts that you can get back to if you're interested later on. I'm not going to be sitting here reading them. They have plenty of details for later if it really interests you. Calibrating our instruments has always been important in our business. And for observing things in the sky, the instruments are people's reports. How do we calibrate them? Then calibrating our displays has also been important to us professionally. The displays for the sky reports is the news media. How do we calibrate them? These kind of events and my justification for getting involved help us calibrate and show just how far off people's perceptions can be. Not because they're stupid or drunk or anything. They're actually following time-tested standard visual cortex processes that were survival positive in the past. And I'm going to address that briefly. But they're getting the wrong impression of things they're seeing using those procedures, using those tested procedures. Also, calibrating the news media has been as disappointing as you could predict. They use these stories primarily to attract customers to different websites. The principle I made up of is commercializing gullibility. You can charge more for commercial messages on your website if you can guarantee gullible viewers. And to get gullible viewers, you use these kind of stories to bring them in. I doubt we're going to get we're going to get a couple dozen people here, but we're the ones who are trying to figure these things out. Now, this event that we're talking about was one of, it turns out, a series of events over the past, throughout the space age, in which satellites re-entered. There's a special condition that they have to meet to create this particular illusion, or is not the right word for it. It's a perception. This particular misperception. It has to be at night, clear sky. Has to be a large satellite, preferably a booster rocket, because it's got lots of heavy pieces in it, lots of high temperature resistant pieces in it that create a swarm of fireballs. And it's got to have an audience. People see it on the ground. This happened most recently in October over Maui, over Hawaii. It's all over the news then. It's been pushed by new stories since then, but you can go look it up. It was a very major news event. And when the scientists out there came out with the explanations, the correct ones, there was a massive reaction of public commentators about against that. That's kind of unsettling and kind of sad, but that's kind of a good role for people in the spaceflight popularization and spaceflight explanation business. The report, next slide here about the condensed version, I made a lot of collections of comments and the reasons people were giving for not believing it was a satellite reentry. A lot of them were very rational and were based on things that they read before. They weren't all superstitious. They weren't all, most of them weren't. Most of them were normal people who were judging the images, what they saw, from what they'd seen in the media before. At the bottom of this page, there's a discussion of a blog that I've been working on, what I call rocket spotting. You've heard of train spotting, plane spotting. Rocket spotting is discussing different ways people spot spaceflight and how they report them or misreport them. Aside from explaining those and solving those, it answers a question a lot of us have often had. These reports that wind up in the UFO literature actually have some very often contain really good information about the spaceflight event being observed and not being understood. It explains to me why a lot of people in the US government want to collect UFO reports from Russia and China and around that area, not because they're real, but because they aren't real, because they are reporting on events over there of legitimate interest to US military intelligence. And if they are doing that, they wouldn't admit it. Now, my original presentation, my intentions of the original presentation was not to talk about true UFOs. This is about one particular event, October 24th last in Hawaii. And from that event, and compared to previous events that I've been studying for a number of years, we can generalize some principles about recognizing these events, getting information about the space flight behind the events, and preparing for future events. The Hawaii called Mothership was basically a very classic story. A fireball swarm, dozens of bright lights crossing the sky in a minute or two. It was perfect. It was evening, best of all. It had witnesses outside, chemically prepared for strange things like Saturday night, clear local weather, and within hours, dozens, if not 100 videos were all over the internet. The majority of the viewers, or the posters, don't know about the viewers because we didn't do a random sample, but the posters saw not bright lights crossing the sky, although some did. They saw a structured object with a border, a physical object with lights on it, windows, steering lights, something or other. They saw it plain as day, and they perceived it, and could not be dissuaded from saying it was not that. But the reason they saw it sometimes are based on correct or incorrect information they already had in their heads. There's also a Starlink launch a couple hours earlier. The Orion meteors are going on. They were all sideshows. One of the main things we saw about this event and other events similar is that nobody had any idea how far away it was. Although in the reports, there was buried unrecognized information that precisely defined how far away it was. And I'll get to that shortly. People also looking straight up in the sky as they're moving or walking or calling to people would lose track of the line of sight and report the object stopping, reversing, zigzagging in the sky. All of the instrumented observations of this event show that it did not. But many viewers were absolutely convinced that it had been doing that. And they sure didn't like being told it was only a satellite reentry. They really didn't like it. Next picture shows a couple of photographs of the event showing a swarm of lights crossing the sky. So it rose in the west, crossed from Maui, crossed overhead from the Big Island, and Hawaii crossed in the northern sky, from further north across in the southern sky, and then descended in the east. Now, they're verbal descriptions, and I collected a number of them of people trying not to interpret what they saw. So I've got several of them here that you can read at your leisure. But they were seeing a massive thing, a triangular aircraft shape with structure, and again, massive, leaving some kind of a jet trail behind it. This was the most common description that was being given. There were a lot of videos. There were no drawings because, well, people didn't think about that. But I kept pestering people who said they saw it. Can you get a drawing, because your eye would see a lot more clearly into this glare, and the video camera is going to be stopped down so much it's not going to see the detail. So in the end, I got two very fine drawings of what people were seeing. Here's one of them from Eric Weiss, who was toward the north. He basically saw a string of lights, but a string of lights in a silhouette. That was his one view. Lots and lots of lights. Going through the comments Again, we can, again, take your time to go through those. I've highlighted in red some of the key phrases. But a huge spaceship, a huge round body, a huge ship, a blimp-sized object covered in lights, a massive mothership. This is what people were perceiving in the sky. Some more other comments, and you can go back to those YouTube sites and see hundreds of those. On my longer report, I collected them there. Again, it's an ordeal to go through them, but when you go through them, you see the repetitive patterns of perceptions. In the middle of this page, Frank Smith said it floated by him at 1,500 feet altitude. They were saying how it was below the clouds. It was right overhead. Too solid and organized, flying horizontally, which they know falling satellites don't do. So that's their reportage. Another report here, again, a longer person here named Sean Ehrlich gave a very careful report and the kind of things you expect and hope people do. There was no reentry because it was a lot lower to the ground, no rocket booster, because it was close to the ground, and they were judging that based upon their guess of the size of it. The real golden observation I got here from Claire Balho, she was on the north coast of the Big Island, looking north. And again, she was describing it, and I pestered her, and she finally made this drawing. She was on the northwest coast of the Big Island, and this was low in the northern sky. Now, outside of the lights on there, take a look over in the right-hand part of the chart of her drawing, where in the middle of the halfway up the page, where she says North Star. I could see it through the ship as it passed by. Now that is what you look for. That's the clue, because North Star says the elevation angle of this object was 20 degrees. That's the latitude of Hawaii. So now we know the elevation angle from that point on the ground. You can pass on Jeff's reports, again, detailed reports, and go to the chart where it says eyes can lie, but geometry doesn't. It's basic stuff. Bajo was on the Big Island at Waikoloa, the resort, looking north, and saw the object at an angle of 20 degrees, elevation angle of 20 degrees. On Maui, the object was seen directly overhead, and Maui was 100 miles away. You can do that, we can do that in our heads as control people. The angle of elevation shows that the altitude over Maui was about 40 miles. There was no airplane, there was nobody 1,500 feet up, nobody under the clouds. It was 40 miles up. And on the lower left-hand part of the chart, I have an excerpt from a bigger chart we'll see in full later on of another satellite, NASA satellite that did demise, it did tear apart. And it found the fireball section began about 70 kilometers up. 70 kilometers, do the math, 42 miles. The fireball was occurring at about 40 miles up, precisely where reentry fireballs are most active. And so it was this particular report. Other reports gave similar features. One other way you can find out the angle, if they don't give it, sometimes they take pictures of the object and then they take pictures of their friends looking at the object. And the friends are either pointing or aiming cameras. Now you've got another source elevation angle. And that kind of information helps you give the real geometry. So 40 miles up. Now the explanation of the object was pretty straightforward. It was reentry, a third stage of a Chinese booster launched a number of years ago, about 12 years ago, for a commercial payload. The entry was predicted, although as we all know, you can't predict satellite reentries more than a couple hours until they actually begin, as you're skimming the upper atmosphere. The ground track, though, when propagated forward for the time of the observation, is on the chart right there, directly over Maui. And any debris would be 1,000 miles to the east. So we have everything fits. And so this is a standard event. It's happened a dozen times, major cases before, and many other smaller cases. You need those conditions. You need special conditions. You get the collection of bright lights. It takes about 2 minutes to cross the sky. The tails start about 40 miles up, run for half a minute or so. They die out while the lights continue for another minute as it crosses the horizon. Because it's dazzling light at night and you're staring at these bright lights, there's a selective loss of sensitivity in your eye, and you see a darker mass around those bright lights. You see a structure. And this is something that is physiologically perceived. It's not just imagined. There's a common misperception, a structured object. If you're looking straight up at this, often you're distracted, you're calling your friends over, no one's staring directly at it full time. You look back and it seems to have changed course. And so they report that. It didn't change course because we have instrumental readings of it. Now, the agency supposed to check these, here's Aerospace Corporation, aerospace.org, put out an alert the day before that this object was preparing to re-enter, gave a predicted impact point, in this case over the mid-Atlantic, about an hour ahead of time of the actual re-entry. We know that the actual re-entry varies by a couple hours because, first of all, the upper atmospheric density is varying based on solar activity, but also because the object's attitude is varying, it's tumbling. So you don't know the drag level of the object. You have no way of knowing it. And in this case, it went a little further and went up out over Hawaii and made the show. Now, it was captured by instrumented systems on the ground in Hawaii, an all sky camera, and there's a bunch of them there. I found places in the world that have all sky cameras. You don't even think they had cameras, but they still have weather stations. They're part of international networks. And they are very happy to go back and look over their cameras to look for other events that may have captured some space events, which they occasionally do. This is the one on Haleakala telescope, and it shows it rising. The ground is on the right. It's rising and past the moon. So you just go to heavensabove.com, and you can make a chart there of the sky, the view from Maui, rising on the right in the west, passing the moon, circled there. The circle is the moon, and setting in the east. If you look at the Orion constellation over there, the next page has the object going down, setting past the Orion constellation. And there it is. There's the view from another telescope, and there is the cloud. There is the fireball streak. It's a time exposure. It's about 4 to 8 seconds, I believe. And there is the Orion constellation, right where you'd expect it to be. Aerospace Corporation put out their own map on this. Using that data, you can, and plotting for the time, another wonderful website that I use is Wolfram Alpha, which is some old astrophysics term, but wolframalpha.com is a ask me anything kind of a site. You can say, when you put your ask me is location of satellite, in this case, satellite 2008-055B on October 25th at 0802 UTC, and it will give you that map, the map that we have right here. And it shows it crossing, approaching Maui at that point, right over Maui. The reason that these third stages are most interesting, as opposed to a science satellite or jettison parts, is that they have lots of high temperature structures in them. And when they come apart down around about 50 miles because of G-force, because of deceleration. They then create a swarm of these particles, these objects that seem to fly in formation. And it really freaks people out to see them flying in formation, because the only things we know that fly in formation are birds and bees and jet planes and stuff like that, all of which are intelligently controlled, not randomly controlled. We don't, it's just not something that's in a normal person's image base. But this is what big satellites, particularly upper stages, do in this particular situation. Now, the reason that people would worry about this not being a falling satellite is that all the artwork they've ever seen about re-entering satellites, and I've got several on this page, are not just wrong, but they're misleading. They show the fireball and the object falling almost straight down. Actually, the fireball phase runs down to about 40 miles up and it's still moving mostly horizontally at that point. Uh, it's still moving mostly level. Here's the chart I referred to earlier about, in this case, the NASA UARS satellite and its demise. I learned that new phrase. Decay is what happens to an orbit. Demise is what happens to a thing that's in that orbit. And they even use demise as a verb. And I never had seen that, but hey, increase your vocabulary. The fireball altitude begins around 70 or 80 kilometers and gets particularly fierce down around 50 or 60 kilometers. And then it ends. It ends usually around 40 miles up, and the fireball stops. Now, it's even calling it a fireball sucks in all the wrong memories. When you see something in the sky and it reminds you of something, this is a really serious danger in terms of getting the information, because once something in the sky reminds you of something, when you start recounting what you saw, the memory of what it reminded you of piggybacks into your narrative, piggybacks into your mind and into your memory. And this is, again, standard. It's not a malfunction of the human memory system. It is the way things work. So when people are reminded about something, even calling it a fireball implies it has a characteristic of fire, but it doesn't have those characteristics. It is mostly extremely annoyed atmospheric ions that are being smashed, tore apart, and are just trying to get back together again. And that creates a chemoluminescence effect. When the shuttle came in, and a lot of us have seen the shuttle, a couple making passes over the Houston area, leaving that white streak across the sky. There was nothing burning. Not a thing was burning. It was that was the air that it had torn apart that was recombining, and it took a minute or two for that white streak to disappear. So the phrases people use, like fireball or falling satellite, they're all phrases that mislead the memory of someone who's actually seeing the event. That's I think, a fair excuse. And when I talk to people about it and explain it to them, they can see I'm not insulting their intelligence or their sanity or their honesty. And a lot of them really get interested in what that implies. Main thing is, though, it's not a ball of fire. Now, in terms of blinking, the object was seen to blink. Well, blinking lights have been seen before on other reentries. Here are some drawings from the very famous reentry over the Yukon in December of 1996, in which it was another Russian booster rocket. And they are describing the lights crossing the sky and large dark orange lights flashing in sync, flashing lights. Many witnesses were drawing what they had seen up there. This Yukon case, 1996, has been on many videotapes, many videos on the internet and on programs about the best UFOs ever in Canada. They describe how people saw a large structured object. They all agreed on it. Well, they didn't all agree on it. These drawings by some of the witnesses showed dots, showed a stream of lights looking a whole lot like the drawings we got from Hawaii, because it was a whole lot like the origin of that event. Now, the media coverage of the event over Hawaii was, again, freaking out over the lights, over the lights, what they saw, strange lights. And astronomers say it was an old rocket booster. Well, it hit the fan at that point, because people just didn't want to believe that. People like John O'Meara, who was at Keck Observatory, went on local television and said it was an old rocket booster because he'd seen the same reports that I just showed you a few minutes ago. It was expected to come in. It did come in, and it's no longer in orbit. So that's what they saw. It was moving in the same direction at the same time to be expected and at the same altitude. So, hey, it's not just a possibility. That's what it was. Well, that wasn't going to work with people who saw it. You go ahead and look at the comments people were making. Well, it flew up a hill. It tinkled. It changed around. This guy's speaking too much Pakalolo which you can guess is what that means in Hawaiian. And they were not falling. None of them appear to be falling. Well, that's correct. They didn't appear to be falling like the pictures showed they should, because the pictures that they'd seen were wrong. More comments here. Rejecting the explanation, lying, covering it up. Maybe they should call it swamp gas. Lights still working after 12 years in space? No, flashing pieces of it, tumbling. Even a group here saying that it's clear that the object did come from the underwater base that was not far off the Hawaiian coast. Well, you got a lot like that. Why do observers who see bright lights crossing the sky perceive a structured object? And we have just some examples here of bright lights that you would see at night. And all the bright lights we see at night, except maybe in torchlight parades, are on structured objects. So that seeing such lights in the sky are going to remind people of their previous memories, previous events, things that they read about or experienced. And here's the center point, the center context of my presentation. These drawings here are from all across the world of documented reentries. We know the vehicle that re-entered. We know it was there at that time, moving in that direction at those speeds, crossing within eyesight of the witnesses, whether they're in Tennessee or in the Ukraine or in Central Africa or the Caribbean or the Baltic Sea. They were having a nearly identical visual stimulus and perceiving it as a structured object with lights on it. They're so awesomely similar that maybe not the same kind of, maybe not the same year and model of the UFO or not, but they all are structured objects with lights on them. And that's what people unaware of anyone else's observations ever before came up with almost the very same kind of impression. And the point to make on it is that this is not a failure of their eyesight, their brain, their rationality. This is a survival positive adaptation to a world in which sudden, surprising, ambiguous visual events present themselves, and you've got to decide quickly whether it's going to eat you or whether you could eat it. Go back 10,000 years, and the kind of things that people who saw a rustle in the bush, do you think it's a rabbit? And can they grab it? If they grab it quickly and wait too long, it'll get away. Do they think it's a tiger, saber-tooth tiger, and it's going to grab them? Well, they've got to respond in the most hazardous or valuable mode, because if they wait too long and they're wrong, they're someone else's meal, or they don't get the meal. The false positives in this case are very low cost. You get laughed at by your buddies. But the false negatives, in which you didn't recognize the bear or you didn't recognize the rabbit, you don't get a meal, or you're someone else's meal. And so it is normal for people faced with this absolutely bizarre perception, visual perception, to interpret it in the way that hurts least if you're wrong. And that's what they've been doing. They've been doing that. Here's more of these cases, and each of these is detailed reports that I've collected, put together over Russia in 1963. This is a very detailed report. Best of all, it was a double-blind report, because the scientists collecting the data and creating the drawings of what the people reported seeing didn't know what it was themselves. So again, a true double-blind experiment. It's the kind of experiment you'd like to do to calibrate the instrument, calibrate the eye-brain connection of the witness. But it's not one, there's logistic and ethical issues in terms of doing it on purpose. Fortunately, it's happened accidentally. And a number of these cases have allowed us to check it out. There's a booster over Tennessee. Again, another booster rocket, not a payload, not a trash module, but a booster with tanks and engines. What do you got here? Windows in a long oblong structure. Over the Baltic Sea, 1976, another Cosmos 799 rocket body coming in across the water at massive speed. And as the witness, Mikhail Bortnikov said, a sailor, he saw compartments on it and square hatches. Over the Bahamas, 1985, Cosmos 1465 reentry vehicle or rocket body. It came in with but 1,000 or 2,000 feet long, pretty close. Wherever it was big. Lights coming from the sides as if through windows. And on the right-hand side, that is the red circle, is one of the more interesting accounts of witnesses. Not only did they see windows, they saw shapes moving behind the windows, looking at them. This is not the only time that these kind of events have created impressions in witnesses that they saw shapes, they saw the occupants of these vehicles looking at them through the windows. They're not, these are the memories of movies, of events in the past that are flooding into a person's mind when they are totally shocked by this kind of absolutely novel perception. Here over France, the greatest UFO flap in the history of France. Well, again, a booster of the Gorizont 21 ComSat rocket body was seen crossing the country from west to east. And a lot of people saw it as lights or as a mass of lights, or as a oblong. And a lot of them saw it again as a structured object. A structured object, in this case, it's got almost headlights in front of it. We'll get back to that. Over in England, a case, and this is in all the major books, reentry of the Cosmos 2238 rocket body. Long, structured oblong, trailing flames with portholes. Central Africa, 1994. Coming in, or a slow-moving airplane, big as a Boeing 747, with cabin lights as low as the treetops. It was Cosmos 2290's rocket body, about 40 miles up. The most famous case is one over Yukon, Canada, December 1996. And if you were to look this up on YouTube, you'd find 20 or 30 videos about it as the most spectacular and persuasive UFO case in Canadian history. Only it's not what they say that everyone agreed what they saw. A lot of people, like these witnesses, saw a large arrangement of multicolored lights, long row of lights, huge row of lights. Now, one of the witnesses who saw a long row of lights, when he turned a flashlight on it, suddenly saw it approaching him. Well, how does he tell it's approaching him? How do you tell when something's coming closer to you? It's getting bigger. If these are lights and they're spreading out in the sky, it's going to look like it's approaching you. And if you're following your time-tested and bred into us and trained into us, if you see something in the sky and don't know what it is, it's best to interpret it in the most dangerous way you can imagine. Sure enough, coming toward him. What happened to these reports with the media, in terms of calibrating the media, this is over the Yukon case. This chart shows in the upper left-hand corner one of the original drawings of a witness who saw a string of lights and a shape around that light, and also he saw some spotlights. Well, as that drawing got improved on in the right-hand side by other artists and later on by other researchers, on the lower left is the version that they created a few months later. And about 6 months later, they decided that actually it had even more lights, and they issued it again in the lower right of a very complex looking object that doesn't look hardly anything at all like upper left-hand picture, which is what the original witness said. And that's just a matter of dramatic license in the news media. Plus, the websites are trying to attract gullible readers they can charge their commercial messages higher rates for. Over Oregon, Northern California, a booster reentry. Here's the view of one teenage boy. Remember seeing a triangle with jets coming out the back. It was the Radiga booster stage. Over Georgia, 2015, drawings based upon witnesses seeing a reentry of the Cosmos 606 rocket body. So we're at the point where these events are consistent. And over across the Hawaiian Islands, there was an astonishing sky apparition that startled that the witnesses had never seen before in their lives, never even heard of before in their lives. And they made the videos, they posted them. There were no drawings. I finally talked people into giving me those 2 drawings. And in those drawings was some of the crucial information about the actual altitude. The apparition was caused by the predicted natural orbital decay of a piece of space junk. The patterns of perception and misinterpretation match those of previous incidents, dating back 60 years to the dawn of the space age. And yet the interpretation has thrived and spread across the internet and for the mass media, because it's the kind of story that they find they can make best money off of. In terms of conclusions, these observing strange stuff in the sky remains important, because there's potentially new scientific insights, new national security, law enforcement insight. You see something strange in the sky, make a note of it and report it. But at the same time, you need to filter out the kind of things that can be seen that can be explained, so you can isolate and zoom in on the promising unknowns. And there are promising unknowns. I've found some really interesting events, both in this kind of phenomena and some observations from space stations that may have been illegal long-range missile testing being done by nth countries using launch sites in other countries, seen by accident by people in space. Oh boy. Meantime, for the UFO studies, this is a category of reports basically it's a dead end, because they're not authentic. The fact they can't recognize them as not authentic pretty much dooms their scientific credibility until they can finally calibrate themselves and get rid of these distractions and these dead ends and look at what's left. And there could well be important stuff left, whether it's aliens or whether it's military stuff, whether it's anything else. There's a great chance that something useful is in the body of reports that people cannot filter out because they're stuck on stuff like this. Now, in terms of references, the background, Ted Mulchan is a Canadian observer. He has compiled, the past several years, been compiling lists of natural reentries. I've been working with him on that for about 8 or 10 years now. And he's got hundreds of them. And they allow these kinds of patterns to be filtered out and recognized. The second report, done by a French scientist, Jules Fernandez, is about whether or not, how do you study human memory and perception based upon how people react to these perceptions. And he used the French case, the one we used in France back in the early 90s. That turned out to be a rocket body and was seen by thousands of people, many of whom had really bizarre interpretations of it. Well, these are things you can look up. I've got a list of several other reports there that I've done in my rocket spotting studies, and we can skip over that. You can look at any of those of interest. Now, here's, as I said, when you gave the kid got for Christmas present, he got a pile of pony manure, and he was smiling because he said, with all that pony manure, there's bound to be a pony in here somewhere. Here's the pony. What else are the data there trying to tell us that we didn't expect? Those searchlight beams, and there are at least 3 cases in which they're clear-cut discussions of not just searchlight beams, unexplainable, but as in the Yukon and in France, but searchlight beams, as you see on this chart, which are scanning, which are flickering back and forth as the apparition passes overhead. Well, we know, being 40 miles up, this is not light because there's nothing for it to illuminate, to show up. This is some sort of material interaction. And the clue here is that in the 3 cases that we found so far, verified so far, they're all within 2 days of launch of the satellite. So the spacecraft, the booster, just jettisoned, is maybe still safing, maybe still has leftover propellants, maybe has something that when it begins to heat up and reentry begins spraying out. and interacting with the atmosphere up there at near orbital speeds. It could look like the events that Paul Maley was talking about with the shuttle reentry, with the OMS engines for the shuttle reentry. When they fire again at 40 miles up, or about 30 for the shuttle entry, they are leaving puffs of white cloudy puffs that linger for up to a minute and then fade. So something's going on with gas on gas interaction at orbital speed. Other things, but other bizarre things suggest there's a lot to be found out here. We look on the shuttle entry, looking overhead for the shuttle, looking at the overhead window, you see that long column standing up behind the back above the tail, and that's the downstream glow of, again, a very upset air molecules recombining. And on the right is a picture. That's not a time exposure. That is a photograph of the trail after the passage of a shuttle over the Houston area. Along that trail, there are puffs. Those puffs seem to correspond with aft yaw thrusters, RCS yaw thrusters for attitude control, and they are creating glowing clouds of some sort. Down the lower left-hand side is a strange phenomena that was seen in Russia a long time ago when they were testing space-to-ground nuclear warheads. A rocket would go into orbit, break out of orbit, and be firing forward as it descended to the target area. As it fired forward, its plume interacted with the atmosphere ahead of it, and these crescent forms were created. Now, the military significance of this is profound for the Russians, especially because for them this was a first strike surprise weapon. If they realized as they're testing it that in fact it wasn't a surprise, that it had a neon sign parading in front of it as it's approaching its target, this crescent, then maybe the chance of a surprise attack isn't nearly as high as they were hoping. But that is, they reported these things as UFOs in Russia, not as missile tests or warhead tests. They've never confirmed these were warhead tests. We know that because of other data. So strange things are happening up in the sky with gas. Maley wrote about this, and I'll leave that simply for anyone to pursue. And 2 or 3, you might want to pursue this clue. Where does it take us? It's creating some kind of glow. The gas creates a glow, something we didn't expect. And as I said before, you look at the data, and the best part about looking at this kind of strange stuff out there is not to prove you're right, but to prove that something unexpected just kicked you in the stomach. And to me, it's these glows, these kind of glows, these searchlights that are being formed, that the data, that the witness reports and the photographic data for shuttle show do exist, and we don't quite know why. So what do you do about it? Just do this. Watch the skies, know how to measure it, directions, times, log it all fast, keep a record of it, register it, even send it to a UFO registry, because they know what some of these are real, and they're happy to report on them accurately. And people go there looking for information on anomalous events in the atmosphere. And I bet you bottom dollar that the CIA goes to those sites for the same reason, because there are things that they can learn from there about China and Russia. And they would also want to know what they can learn, what the Chinese and Russians can learn about our own secret programs from looking at the UFO sites for people who have misunderstood and misinterpreted other strange stuff in the sky. It's not all nonsense, but finding out the non-nonsensical part of those reports is, take some work, take some inspiration, take some luck. And I guarantee you're it's fun. Hey, thank you very much for listening and recording.
Outstanding, Jim. Outstanding. Fascinating stuff. So any questions for Jim? And Jim, you might stop sharing your screen now. You know, one thing I was wondering is, since you give rational explanations to this, have you ever gotten, say, threatened by people saying you're wrong, you're a government spy or whatever?
I get that all the time. And my stock answer to that is, sorry, I've lost my my charge number and my address for the invoices. If you can find it for me, I'll split the money 50-50. They don't like that kind of smart ass reply.
Anybody else have any comment? Be sure and unmute yourself if you have a question.
You know where to find me. You got my email address, and basically, there's one particular sighting by a cosmonaut back in 1981, south of South Africa, that sure looks like an Israeli ICBM test. And if that's really true, the Mossad is going to come get me.
Yeah, so Dave Pitts, why don't you go ahead and come up and ask your question?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jim. That was very interesting. I worked on 32 shuttle flights, and my team and I were analyzing video and photography for launch safety, but we also did on-orbit photography. And so I answered a number of congressional inquiries about supposed UFOs that were captured by onboard cameras on, for example, STS-48 is a classic example. And those turn out, of course, to be titanium dioxide paint flecks that were dislodged from the payload bay. And then after they get outside the payload bay and the orbiter fires a RCS thruster, the paths change direction. Another case was Linda Godwin's orange drink, which a droplet or two got away from her and hit the and attached itself to one of the windows on the shuttle, and the crew was taking some video, and so this orange UFO was vibrating outside the spacecraft and following the spacecraft supposedly. So I answered a few of those inquiries, but they all were having to do with on orbit cameras.
Let's Dave, let's get in touch. You got my email, or Stokes does, because I've been writing about some of these, and particularly STS-48, because I was on console for that mission. That figuring that out and figuring out where the shadows were and where the sunlight was is the key to that particular very mysterious event. But you had to, what I tried to explain to people was, you have to be able to look in those images and see what's not visible. Well, what does that mean? Where's the shadow of the shuttle? Because you're looking down sun. And so the objects are near the shuttle, they float out of the shuttle shadow and they suddenly appear. And they appear out near the horizon. But the horizon's not on the horizontal. You're at orbital altitude. The horizon is 25 degrees depressed below the horizontal. So if it's on the horizon, it's too low to be sunlit. And try to explain to people that it's really unearthly. It's fun to figure it out, but there are people out there who are trying to use ground think to explain space think. And we've all had the same issue. I'm sure we've all been asked these kind of questions, trying to explain even simple orbital mechanics to people who are sincerely interested. It's beyond the common experience of people around us. I have been having a great deal of satisfaction finding ways to try and put it in the understandable terms. And Dave, those are definitely topics that I've been working on, including also the tether case, where supposedly those objects are passing behind the tether 60 miles away, when it's actually not a fake video, but a video that's edited from different days to create a false impression. It's out there. There are thousands of videos. There are millions of kids who've been misled by this stuff.
There's also a very good book, Jim, that you may be aware of. It's called The Invisible Gorilla. and other ways our intuitions deceive us. You might look into that. That's primarily with Earth-based misperceptions having to do with court cases and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
That's a very
I know
interesting
the
book.
invisible gorilla effect, and it's worked on me when someone first showed me the video. But yeah, you don't see, you got to see things that are not there. And when they, for example, on STS-48, when they say that, well, the thrusters couldn't have been sending a pulse into that part of space where the particles churned, but you can see a flash of it. You see a flash of the fire from the thruster, but that's just the light being reflected. And then the question I ask is, what is it reflecting on? It's a vacuum. If you see a flare in the camera view, it is the plume of the thruster. There's nothing else that'll show up.
Exactly.
But it's a different kind of thinking, and I feel a lot myself. I think we all had the occasion to feel like we're the aliens on this planet sometimes. Guys, thanks a whole lot. We'll pursue this. There are a couple other real interesting angles to this later on. But you've been a good audience, and you certainly can reach me. My homepage is jamesoberg.com, and there's an email on there, but when you use the email, be sure you put the middle initial E in there. That's for the email, not for the homepage, jamesoberg.com.
Hey, Obi, I got a question for you. The last time you talked to the Alumni League, you were talking about your Korean experience.
No?
About your Korean experience?
Korean, yeah.
And the take on it at the time was that they were pretty far behind and had shown you stuff that probably was there just to try to impress, and that they were, but their launch had been a failure. What's your take on them today?
I haven't been watching that closely, but I've been watching the pictures of the launch site. And because I walked around that site and just shot the heck out of it with pictures. And the bizarre thing about my trip to the Korean launch site was when I got back to the States, nobody asked to see the pictures. And, it's not a cover story. No one asked to see them. Either they had someone else on the trip or they weren't interested. But they are working on their launch site. The launch site was designed for launch operations that could be mobile, which is the most interesting thing to me. The site was set up so that if you had to, you could put one of those missiles next to an apartment building and service it from attach points coming out windows of the apartment and launch it. It was all road mobile. Even though they could have piped the fuel to the launch pad, they trucked it from the railhead 3 miles to the launch pad. Well, you only want to do that if you intend to truck the fuel to the rocket operationally, which means you don't want to launch them from there. So those are things you look for. I'm not going back. They made the mistake of letting me out once.
So Karen, are you on?
Yes, I am on.
Why don't you make your comment you had asked?
Oh, I wanted to ask you, Jim, you kept on talking about the word falling, that people want to talk about these things falling when they're not really falling. And I wondered if there was another word that we could push. Are these objects skidding through the Earth's atmosphere? Are they sliding?
I use the word skimming, but
Skimming.
Skimming in the upper atmosphere in a very shallow descent. That even the chart, the reason the reason that they're getting closer to the Earth is primarily because they're not falling over the horizon anymore. When I explain orbital mechanics to to fourth graders, it's always falling toward the Earth, but the Earth's dodging. The Earth is dodging out of the way. But satellite people don't know why. If you track these objects, you can't predict where it's going to hit. Well, you can't predict because the final few hours of before entry, you have unknown drag, both from the air density and unknown drag from the unknown attitude. So you can't predict it. But they don't believe that. NASA's supposed to track all this stuff and know exactly what's going to happen. No, it doesn't. And it is horizontal. The artwork you've seen, and you can look around some more for satellite reentry or anything else and get more images of that. And it shows objects falling downward. And the object that people saw October 24th was not falling downward. It was essentially moving as near to horizontal as the eye could tell. And it did baffle people. And it was a case of several features of that observation which were observed correctly and compared to incorrect expectations for a reentering satellite. So the incorrect expectations is NASA's fault in terms of what does a satellite look like when it reenters, when it demises.
Any other questions?
Well, I'm on this topic for a while, for a long time, as long as I'm on the we got our COVID shots 2 days ago. So I hope you guys are working the same. We're all the right age, right?
Right,
Okay.
right. Okay, well, I guess if no other comments or questions, Jim, thank you so much. This was a very entertaining presentation, as yours always are. I think.
Thanks, everybody.
Very good ones, very good ones.
Mr. Hughes.
All right, I'm going by.
Okay, well, let me tell you about let me stop the recording real quick. And let's see.